Hi, in this video, I introduce to you the themes and topics in chapter 15, the last chapter of your semester. In this particular case, we will be looking at three different versions or three different types of tests of hypotheses for multiple counts and for multiple proportions. I'm opening the PowerPoint slideshow for chapter 15. To review what is a count or a proportion, we go back to the concept of count and the concept of proportion. We start with how a count is a whole number measure of how many times something repeats in a population or in a sample. When we talk about a count in a population, this is referred to as a parameter. Whereas when we refer to a count or a percentage in a sample, this is referred to as a statistic that may possess inferential capabilities and may reveal something about an entire population, as long as the rules of sampling topics covered in chapters 8 and 9 are abided by in this situation. So remember how in chapter 2 we studied about counts and proportions and how they represent the way we statistically describe categorical variables, and how in chapter 6 we looked at three different versions of counting: the binomial, the geometric, and the Poisson models. We also then evolved this particular topic in chapter 7 by looking at situations in which the normal model is a helpful way of approximating large repetition cases of binomial counts and of Poisson counts. And now in chapter 9, we then developed a way and a means to identify statistically a whole probability model of possible counts in the form of sample proportions. Now in chapter 15, we're going to make three applications of this particular insight in the case of multiple or many counts or many proportions. We have three such applications: multiple populations, homogeneity between one kind of categorization and another kind of categorization, and independence between two categories. The test statistic is what we denote by variance, essentially, a variance between what we observe in the data and what is expected according to the structure of these three variety of problems that we look at. And so for each of these variety of problems, the degrees of freedom will vary in the model called the CHISQUARE model, which is the test statistic employed for these applications. And throughout the remainder of this video, we will show how to use StatCrunch in order to achieve or attain the necessary tools for both building confidence intervals, but primarily to test these three varieties of hypotheses. A hypothesis test of multiple counts, an example of this would be a problem such as problem 2 in your lab 15. Suppose that you found in a sample of 120 students, and this sample hopefully is a random sample of students, that 24 were born in winter, 35 in spring, 33 in the summer, and 28 in the fall. What if you wanted to test the hypothesis that there are no differences in number of births by season, winter, spring, summer, and fall? You should observe in the population, at the population level, births being the same in all four groupings. How would we perform such a test? Well, the way we would do that is we would enter the following table that you see in the PowerPoint slideshow, where you would have by season the observed birth counts, and then you would create an expected count based on the null hypothesis. In this case, the null hypothesis is that births are no different across all seasons. So if that were the case, you would observe 30 births each and every season for a total also of 120. Following that, you would go into StatCrunch and use the feature within Stat called goodness of fit, chi-square test, and you would then select the observed and the expected columns that you entered and click on compute. When you then click on compute, what you would ultimately observe is a table that measures the test statistic under the header called chi-square and the p-value of the test. And you would treat this as you would treat a one sample test of hypotheses, just like the ones in chapter 10 and in chapter 11, where you did tests of individual proportions and tests of individual means in chapter 12. So the actual testing procedure and methodology would not vary again. What varies is how you calculate the test statistic and what the probability model is, but not the meaning of a p-value and how to use a p-value to either reject or not reject the null hypothesis. In this case, a p-value of 48%, a p-value of 48% implies that the null hypothesis of the number of births being the same across all seasons has a 48% chance of being true. Given that we usually test hypotheses with reasonable doubt levels or levels of significance of 5%, it shouldn't be reasonable to reject the null. So our conclusion should be to not reject the null and to in effect assert the null hypothesis that births are the same in all 4 seasons. How about a test of homogeneity? Well, in the case of a test of homogeneity, what you have is a population of data being counted in 2 different ways. In this case, for example, we're going to use problem 4 of lab 15. In this problem, we break down a population of people who go to a bank branch location for bank services, and there we break down the distribution of clients by how old they are and also by where they go in town. In this case, we're going to test the hypothesis that the age distribution of the clients is the same no matter what the branch is. And that is why this is called a test of homogeneity, because in homogeneity, the word homogeneous means one type. And therefore, we're asserting with a null hypothesis that there's no age difference between the customers who go, say, to the location in town versus the location near a mall. So by using the observed counts that are given to you in the problem, we can then apply the null hypothesis of equivalent values. We can build a null hypothesis of equivalent values or expected values based on the totals by age across the branch locations. Since we have, for example, 50 people under 30, we're going to put 25 people in the mall and 25 people in the town. These numbers are not real. These numbers are the expectations under a situation where the null hypothesis is that the number of people by age group is the same visiting all branches. And so we're distributing the 100 people who go to the mall and the 100 people who went to the in-town bank branch by age and making those equal. That's why this is called a test of homogeneity. Once we've done that, we then have to take this table and break it down into a single column of observations and a single column of expectations. And so it then becomes important to use the tabular view of the observed values, put those in a single column, and then put what the null hypothesis values would be exactly if you had homogeneity in the populations visiting your bank branches. Once you do that, you then proceed just like you did in the test of multiple proportions by going into Stat, Goodness of Fit, chi-square test, and you would select the observations and the expectations and then click on compute. And it would give you, as a result, the chi-square and the p-value of the test. And you can then interpret the chi-square and the p-value of the test as stated in the slideshow that accompanies this video. The third and last kind of hypothesis test that can be done with this technology is a hypothesis test of independence between the rows and the columns of a data table. In this case, we're going to use problem 12 in your lab 15 as a demonstration problem. And we're going to look at an application under the Equal Protection Act clause of the Civil Rights Act, and in particular, an illegal practice in housing discrimination called racial steering. Racial steering occurs, according to the problem, when real estate agents show buyers only homes in certain neighborhoods dominated by that family's race. And so you steer groups by race or by ethnicity into neighborhoods that are majoritarily within the racial and ethnic composition of the household looking for rent or for purchase of homes. And in this case, tenants at a large apartment complex filed a lawsuit alleging that there was steering that led to them not being shown homes that they were interested in, and instead being shown only homes in the racially steered neighborhoods. So in order to perform a test that would hold up in court, that there is a suspicion of racial steering, what you would do is you would enter the data given in the problem into an Excel template that I built for you. The Excel template is called Template for Chi-Square Tests of Independence. I'm currently going to switch to that particular file. This file, this Excel file, this template that does the math for you, that computes the math for you so that you can then interpret the statistics for this kind of independence testing, is found in Module 15 under the support files in Module 15. So what I did was I entered the data by column 1 and 2, which were separated by race. So in this case, I think it was the two races were first in the data set were white and African American was the second one. White and black were the races. And then neighborhoods were neighborhood 1 and neighborhood 2. And so what this software does is upon entering these blue numbers, these yellow cells automatically calculate the row, column, and overall totals, which then enable you to compute these expected values under the hypothesis of independence, which is how many people you would need to find who are white or black in neighborhoods 1 and 2 in order for you to have the null hypothesis of no relation between the rows and the columns being present. And in this case, you can see how instead of a distribution of 92 and 85, you would have a distribution of 86 and 91 here, and 18 and 20 instead of 12 and 26. So there are quite marked differences between the observed data values and what you would observe if neighborhoods were truly, so to speak, race or ethnicity or colorblind. Upon comparing each and every blue to each and every yellow cell, a component of the variance between what you see and what you would expect to see under independence is computed in the green cells. And finally, the test statistic and the p-value are then calculated at the very next group of tabular cells for this particular case. How do we interpret this data? How do we interpret these results? The interpretations of the results are that we have a variance between what we see in the behavior of real estate agents showing units versus what we would expect to see in a completely race-blind situation at a variation of 5.2. And that would yield, in this chi-square situation, a probability of 2.2% that the neighborhood and the race would be independent factors in this particular situation or context. Since we usually test the null hypothesis at a significance level of 5%, in other words, since we usually have a benefit of doubt, a reasonable doubt of 5% to reject the null hypothesis, this probability value of 2.2% falls short of that. So it is therefore reasonable to reject the null hypothesis of independence and to conclude that race steering is likely occurring in the way in which real estate agents are steering tenants to these different neighborhoods by race. And so in a court of law, a test of this sort would be presented by an expert data analyst to imply or to suggest that racial steering is possibly occurring. This would not be sufficient to for a jury to completely condemn the agents involved or the companies involved, but it would be part of the evidence that would be presented or filed to move this case forward to a trial, to a jury trial, as a civil rights violation. So in many cases, a lot of these hypothesis tests are highly useful at indicating potential violations of different kinds of laws, and they're employed in legal settings, in almost all circumstances of civil trials. I thank you for watching this video, and I thank you for participating this semester in this course, and I wish you a good and healthy and happy summer. Thank you.